Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek German King Tiger heavy tank. This video update, the model's paintwork has been completed, which would include the markings as well as, most importantly, the weathering. In addition to that, you'll see that the tracks have been prepped and mounted to the model at this point in a permanent manner. So from here, let's go ahead and start this video off because there's going to be a bunch of info coming right at you. Starting this video off takes us to the tracks. The tracks, as I touched upon in a couple videos ago, were removed off of the model when the tank slid off into its painting procedure. The tracks, while off of the model, also went into their own painting procedure that I touched upon in the other video. The tracks on these 1/6 scale RC tanks, I like to remove them and get them washed before I go ahead and actually apply the paint. Because these models are radio controlled, when you test drive them during the construction, undoubtedly you're going to get dirt and debris in the gristle and hinge areas of the tracks. Obviously this material is less than ideal when it comes time for adding the paint. Some people out there would disagree and they want to paint over all the dirt and muck, but that's a really low quality way to build and paint things, and so the least said about that the better. So the tracks were removed off the model, obviously, and then I went ahead and hosed them down. I thoroughly washed the inner and outer sections of the track, getting as much of that dirt and residue off as much as possible. When the tracks are fully dried off, it is at this point here where they're ready to receive their coat of paint. To paint my 1/6 scale radio control tank tracks, I like to use this paint right over here. It's Rust-Oleum Automotive Primer. This is a dark gray coloring, and one thing I always liked about this paint was the color of the paint when it sets. It has a really realistic Parkerized look to it, which is something that would be seen on these type of tracks. I'm not really sure if the tracks are actually Parkerized, but they did have some kind of an oxide finish on them that closely resembles this paint that we have right here. The paint is fairly easily come by. You can pick it up in any hardware store. Unfortunately, the prices have gone up on them, but you know, welcome to current year. This paint here is still a fantastic choice for use on your tracks of this medium. This paint is also the exact same paint that I use on my 1/16 scale radio-controlled metal tank tracks for the exact same reasons. This paint here, it's really good for this application. Unfortunately, the one thing that you absolutely do not want to use this paint on is single-piece vinyl tracks. If you're working on a 135, do not use this paint at all. Stay away from it. This paint is only acceptable on metal tracks. If you have metal workable links, either 1/6, 1/16, or 135, that's when this paint becomes handy. If it's not, stay away from it like the plague. One other thing I want to mention is that the volume of paint going to be needed is going to be depending on the tank that you're building. Some tanks are smaller than others, and a 1/6 scale tank generally is going to be utilizing 2 cans. On a King Tiger like this, as you can see, the track is quite long and quite wide. Not to mention there's 2 sides of it. One side's flat, the other side has the gristle on it, so you are going to need a decent volume of paint. Currently I have about 3 or 4 cans of this stuff, so that should be enough to thoroughly coat the tracks with not just a single coat, but also a few other coats added on top of it just to build up some durability to the paint. But we'll see how that pans out once the tracks are fully painted, which it's time for me to go ahead and get on that. So here are the tracks painted. Of course, I wear a respirator when I'm using this stuff. You don't want to be an idiot and get this crap in your lungs. But regardless, I was able to do the job with the paint that I had on hand with a little bit to spare. You can see the empties right over here. 2 of those cans are the fresh ones that I just bought. The other 2 were just some extra ones that I had on hand. There was just a little bit of stuff left in it, so I went ahead and just dumped it on the tracks. And I was able to basically complete the tracks both thoroughly in and out with 3 cans total. The other cans are really more or less negligible. But here we have the last of the Mohicans. Right here is a good 3/4, maybe half left in here. So that's going to be perfect for painting the remainder of the spare links. But here you can see what the tracks look like once fully painted. For anyone who works on smaller scale models, this is basically copy and paste, just in a much larger scale, quite figuratively and literally. So from here, the tracks are going to thoroughly dry, and at that point they're ready for installation. I'll touch upon the weathering or the lack thereof on these tracks momentarily once they are resecured to the vehicle. So picking up where we left off last week was with the camouflage pattern being applied and the model is ready to head off into the next step. Before I go ahead and get the tank weathered, I need to do the markings. Now for the markings on any other model, generally you would use some kind of water slide decals or a dry transfer, you know, something along those lines. However, for a 1/6 scale model, it's a bit different of a story. Generally when it comes to markings in 1/6 scale, you're not going to be using water slide decals. One, there's really not that many out there. And two, honestly, in my opinion, water slide decals really aren't the best solution for a 1/6 scale model. The decals are really large. They become a bit difficult to maneuver onto the model. And also, and quite frankly put, water slide decals just don't look that realistic in larger scales. For smaller scales like 1/16, 1/35 and smaller, they're perfect. There's nothing wrong with decals and they're really, really great. However, when you cross over that threshold into the 1/6 scale, this is where you're going to want to start changing up your format for applying the markings. Now, for me, what I like to use stencils. Stenciling is, in my opinion, the best, hands down way to do markings in this scale. It's literally exactly as per the real one, okay? Real markings on these vehicles were applied with paint via stencils. So you're really getting that realism transferred over into the smaller scale build. The trick is you're going to need to have a stencil. Now, there are some companies out there that produce stencils. Armortek, I'm just going to give him a quick shout out. He is one of them. His stencils for a while were made out of photo etch pieces of brass, and then you would basically line them up on the model and use that to apply the paint. However, as nice as those stencils are, you are a bit limited to the font, the size, and basically the style of marking that he offers. For most applications, it's fine, but instead of going with that route, on all of my builds, I like to custom make my own stencils. Obviously, this opens up the spectrum on the type of markings and the freedom that it allows you to go ahead and really fine-tune the build to make it more to the specs that you're looking for. And the way I like to do it as well, with this technique that we have here. So what I have here are some, which are going to become stencils momentarily, but here go the markings that are going to be applied to the model. For this build, the customer requested to have just a number painted on the side, which for a late pattern German vehicle is not something that would be uncommon for a number of reasons. However, for the markings themselves, I went ahead and opened up Adobe Photoshop, or actually for this one I used Illustrator, and I came up with the number that we have here. I also went ahead and took some measurements off the side of the model, and I printed on some test pieces of paper in order to get the number at the correct kerning and leading. For the font itself, this is again where you have some variation available to you. For me personally though, on my German build, I like to use the following typeface, and if anyone's curious what typeface this is, well, this is actually the typeface that comes with Half-Life 2. If you ever played that video game, well, when you download it, the numbers, the weapon schematics, all that stuff that's in the game, it's actually a TTF typeface, which is excellent because this allows you to go ahead and cobble up numbers as you wish, and the typeface is really, really close to many of the typefaces used on the real German tanks during World War II. And because it's a TTF, this allows you the ability to up and down scale as you deem accordingly, not to mention adjusting the leading and kerning of the numbers. So here we have the numbers over here. Right now, this is actually printed on sticker paper. This sticker paper is something that you can find in Staples, and it's really easily come by. This is basically the technique that I've touched upon in a couple other videos, and this is the de facto way that I make my markings on my 1/6 scale tanks. Specifically in this version here with this font, my German tanks. However, right now, it's just some markings on paper, and it's not yet a stencil. I'm going to have to turn this into a stencil, and to do that, I'm first going to have to cut the two sections from each other. This is obviously going to be done with a scissor, and once this is done, I can actually begin the removal process of carving out each of the numbers that we have here. Once the paper is cut in half with the scissor, it's now time to cut out the actual numbers themselves, and obviously you're not going to be able to use a scissor to cut these out. To cut these out, you're going to need something a little bit more precision, and obviously the go-to would be an X-Acto knife. A sharp X-Acto is the de facto way to cut these type of markings out from here. I've used them in the past, I recommend them, and it'll basically get the job done. However, I don't have any X-Actos on hand, so instead I'm just going to utilize this small little El Cheapo $1 snap blade knife that I picked up from the hardware store the other day. In the past, I've also utilized this unit over here, but as you can see, this thing has been used quite extensively, and yeah, it's basically falling apart here. I'm still going to utilize it on my small-scale builds, but for precision work like this, nah, I'm just going to rely on the newer one for this. So in addition to the knife, you also need something to put onto the tabletop in order to protect the surface, but more importantly, it's used to keep the blades from dulling in a faster rate. This is where most people on YouTube or on the internet will have one of those really cool vinyl placemats that have a grid and some numbers, and they have like stars and, you know, different scales and sizes and all that good stuff. And no, I don't have one of those. I never really thought it was necessary, because I just go with the ghetto route, and that's by using a phone book. Yep, a boomerific phone book. That's what I use. So the phone book will do literally the exact same job as the vinyl piece, and it'll do it for literally no money. These things are free, and they're just giving them away. So in addition to the phone book, I'm also going to need, you don't necessarily have to do this if your hand is straight enough, but it does help to have a straight edge to help press or flatten the paper out, and also give you a nice strong straight edge to use as a guide when cutting. And for that, I'm just going to utilize my square that I have here. You can also obviously use one of those really nice rulers with the cork underneath. That will do the job just fine, but you know, this one here will also do the same job. So carving out the numbers, obviously it's best to start with the straight edge. And luckily this number here has mostly just straight edges, with the exception of that 6, which we'll circle back to momentarily. Whenever I cut these numbers out, I like to always start with the verticals on all of the sections, and then from there I could go ahead and take care of the other ones. This is just a way to streamline things a little bit, and it'll take up less time. Come to the end and it still doesn't fall off, probably just a little poke or two of paper that's just used to hold it in place, and then with just a little strategic little stab, the number pops right out. So there's a literal 1 out of the way. It's now time to get to the others. So I'll start with the 4, and then we'll transition over into the 6. For numbers like 4s, where you have a lot of this internal structure over here, it's still something that could obviously be done, but you just want to take some care with the undercuts in these areas. The really tricky part are things like 6s, 9s, and 8s are something that are always a bit tricky. Obviously, you're going to have to cut this center portion out over here, but before I can do that, I just want to cut out the actual number itself. This one, you're going to still start with the straightaways. Like, let's just get the one on the top here over with. Nice little incision right there. And then the 2 straight sections that come off of the 6's top area. Okay. Okay, so with those out of the way, it's now time to do this freehand. And I'm just going to basically start and carefully cut along the line. And this is where a sharp blade is absolutely paramount. If the blade is dull, it's going to snag, and you're going to get little bumps and rips as opposed to a nice clean cut. If you're going to be doing this method, I strongly recommend just starting with a fresh blade, be it either an X-Acto, or if you have something like this, just snap the current one off, and now you have a brand new fresh blade ready to go. It will definitely make your life a lot easier, as it did for me. So there we go. There's the number right there, 146. But I still need to cut out the center portion of the 6. This is something that can be done with either a scissor, or you can also use the blade if one wants to give that a shot. Luckily, this blade's still really, really good. I can feel it getting a little dull, but it's still, it's the little engine that could. This is why, again, you need to have some kind of a soft surface to do this on. Those vinyl things do work great, but obviously so does a phone book. And the best part about the phone book is once the paper gets thoroughly nicked and cut up, you just rip the page off and you have a brand new one underneath. Okay, and there we go. There's the little donut hole for the 6. Obviously, you don't want to lose that because that is going to be very important when it comes time for adhering it onto the side of the tank. So with the numbers cut out, I'm going to do the exact same procedure that you just saw on these ones over here, but there's no point getting that on camera, so we'll cut across to when we're ready to start adhering the stencils to the side of the turret. With the stencils out of the way, it's now time to apply the stencils to the side of the vehicle itself. So here we have the model, of course, with the turret placed on the hull, and here we have the sample marking sheet that I touched upon earlier, and I'm just going to basically get a good idea on how it's going to be mounted, or I should say applied to the model. At this point here you can get the height, the actual alignment just right, so it's going to go around here, thereabouts. Much along the lines as my 366 King Tiger that I built all those years ago. I'm going to make it a little bit higher. Yeah, there we go, just like that. Okay, so that's how it's going to be basically laid out. So here we have the template version right here. Now, when you're using the sticker paper, the way this works is the back portion is the part that you need to peel away. It's going to reveal the gluey section, so you could stick it on whatever object that you're going to do. This is, you know, pretty straightforward and easy enough. Just find that special sweet spot, and then the paper. Of course, now I'm getting on video. It's going to rip on me, but, you know, that's how things usually work. When you're peeling off the paper, you want to be careful, specifically on numbers like 4s or 5s. That's really important to watch out for because you can tear it, and that's obviously not going to help anybody. So from here, I could go ahead and basically line up the number where I mentioned before. There we go. So the marking itself has now been applied, or I should say the stencil has been applied to the model surface. You want to do a visual check to make sure it's not canted or anything. Looks like it's where it needs to be. Okay, so now that this is applied, now you need to go ahead and thoroughly mask up this area, and you could never have a mask that's too small. You always want to have the bigger, the better. I've seen situations where the thing was huge and it was just a little sliver in the corner that wasn't protected, and then once the markings were applied and the mask were peeled, there was some overspray in that section over there. It's like, it's baffling how easy that can happen. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and thoroughly mask it up even further. To do this, you could use any sort of material from paper to plastic bags, basically any opaque object that can shield the model from the paint is going to be utilized for this application. And also, of course, masking tape is going to be your friend in this type of procedure. In addition to masking it off, the blue painter's tape will also do a good job in keeping the stencil onto the model surface in a much stronger format compared to just relying on the sticker glues alone. The last mask to put on is the donut hole right here for the number 6, and basically just line it up accordingly. You want to make sure that the width is as even as possible. Just basically eyeball it. Okay, so once the donut hole is applied, the marking is ready to go. It's ready for its airbrushing. At this time, you can also see the amount of shielding that I placed on the side of the model. I was not messing around when I was mentioning that earlier. I can technically apply the stencil, or the other stencil I made, to the opposite side of the model and repeat the process of the shielding. However, even though this is definitely doable, I tend to not go with that route. I tend to do one at a time. And the reason why I do this is because this is probably the best way to ensure continuity, because you don't really know exactly where the marking is going to line up on the turret or on the hull of the model with all the shielding in the way. So once the marking is airbrushed on and the paint's dry, I peel it off. In many cases, you could just reuse the same stencil. These stencils can be used probably about 2-3 times max. But the other reason is I can then take measurements with a caliper and figure out exactly where the height of the markings end in proximity, or I should say in relation to the top portion here of the hull. Technically, I could just do it right now, but again, I'd like to play it safe, so I like to do this, you know, slowly but surely, as opposed to just, you know, winging it in one shot. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and airbrush on the marking, and the color I'm going to be utilizing for this one is going to be Tamiya Flat Yellow. This was the color that was seen in the sample image that I referenced in the last video. And for the airbrush, I'm going to be utilizing my Poshy double action airbrush here. I've mentioned this in many, many videos. And this is the type of work that it really does best with. So let's go ahead and apply on the paint. When it comes for applying yellow specifically, yellow, like I mentioned in the Korean War patent video, it is a skill set in its own right. Yellow is definitely one of those pain in the ass colors, and you have to make sure that the consistency is right, the PSI is right. It takes a bit of research and development in order to figure out exactly how to make yellow work best for you. On this model here, I should be able to get it in one shot, but it may take a second coat depending on, again, how good that first coat is. So this is going to be a learning experience for us both. I also want to mention that this is actually the first 1/6 scale German tank that I've done that utilizes yellow markings as opposed to just white, red, and even blue that I've mentioned and seen and shown in other videos. So this one here is a little bit groundbreaking in that regard. It's a small little bit of detail, but I just want to point out regardless. So when you're airbrushing, sometimes these underpieces like the floors tend to kick up. That happens, just want to go in here with a toothpick, or in this case a nail. Alright, that looks like it'll do the trick. Just add a little touch-ups here and there. Alright, perfect. One really nice thing about Tamiya paints is just how fast the stuff dries on, specifically when applied to the surface. So it's only been about 2 or 3 minutes since I applied the paint. I cleaned the airbrush out to make sure it's nice and clean for when I do the opposite side. And so I can see that the paint, by the most part, is pretty much dry. So now we go ahead and make like it's Christmas morning and start the unwrapping. As for these masks and shields over here, they will definitely be recycled on the opposite side. Not so sure about the number though. I think this one, I think I'm going to use the other one. Have it nice and fresh. No real reason not to. Okay. And here we go. Alright, for the donut hole for this, I'm going to use an X-Acto to pry it off, which I don't have here at the moment. So, I'll be right back. And there you go. The tank has been christened as number 146. So, I'm going to let the paint dry a little bit more, but during the drying process, I'm going to go ahead and start the application process to the opposite side. Basically, it's going to be rinse, wash, and repeat. However, what I am going to do is I'm going to take a careful measurement between the top of this line over here for the armor plate and the top portions here of the numbers. Once I have that gauged out, I can just go ahead and mirror that on the opposite side, and this will help with keeping the model with its continuity, and it'll prevent any sort, or I should say minimize as much as possible, any sort of the marking shifting during the actual application or layout process. So here's the marking applied on the opposite side with the exact same techniques that I just mentioned. On this one here, I had to do a little bit more refinement compared to the one on the opposite side. There was a little bit more overspray from the mist just getting in between the stencil and the model. Again, this is something that is not uncommon, but fortunately it's easy to touch up. Basically what I do is I take masking tape like this. Now on the straightaways where there was a little bit of overspray, I just protect the number. With the airbrush, with the green, I just go over, removing that little bit of overspray. Once that's completed, the number is ready to go at that point. So from this point onward, the tank is now going to head off into weathering. This is going to be done in the usual type format that I've touched upon in any number of my videos, and it's going to be starting primarily with the airbrush, where I go over with all sorts of different techniques, namely counter shading and double toning, and then some filters on top of that. And then the next step will be the use of dry brushing, but we'll circle back to once all that is complete. From here, let me go ahead and start with the weathering process. So after a little bit of airbrush and dry brushing work, here you can see the model with the weathering for the most part completed. There are a few more things that I'm going to be adding to the model, but by and large what you see here is generally what it's going to look like. At the moment, I'm wrapping up the dry brushing that's on the remainder of the tin work, and then once that's added, we'll be ready for installation to the model. However, at this point here, I'm actually ready to install on the tracks. So let me go ahead and quickly wrap up the dry brushing work done on the tin work so that I could go through the track mounting procedure. So one thing that I showed earlier was the tracks getting its coat of dark gray primer. Well, in addition to the tracks getting primed, I went ahead and also primed the pins and also the retention washers. Obviously, these need to be painted as well in order to blend in with the remainder of the track work, or else you will have these pieces stick out like a sore thumb, which is something you really don't want to do. During the painting, you'll see that I went ahead and masked up the center portion of the pins, because obviously you don't want to get paint in these sections over here. The only pieces where the paint is relevant is on the end sections on both the forward and rear stem. Once I peel the tape off, the paint will only be on the appropriate locations, which in turn, one, saves on paint, but two, will also keep the center portion nice and debris-free, which is relevant because it will make the insertion of the pins more easily done, and also be less things to interfere with the hinge during its articulation. So here are the tracks now ready for mounting. You can see what they look like with that primer in its fully dried state. As I mentioned earlier, this color is really good with mimicking the look of the parkerized or oxide finish that's found on a large number of the CAF's tracks, King Tiger, and definitely most of the German tracks included. Normally on my models, I tend to weather further with other sorts of techniques and dry brushing and things like that. However, for this model over here, and this is also going to be true for the wheels, that's not going to be necessary because this model is radio controlled and these parts are metal. These are going to wear and weather naturally on their own. So for the tracks, in order to get that nice scratched up metal surface, it's only going to require a few laps around the driveway in order to accomplish that. And the same is also going to be true for the steel rimmed wheels. So with the camera readjusted, you get to see what it looks like on the front end side. At this point here, the track has been ratcheted into place, which will allow me easier access to pin the tracks together. The other thing to mention is with the orientation of the track itself, specifically on the King Tiger, and same is true for the Tiger 1, you do have a certain pattern on how the tracks will index onto the sprocket, where on one side you have more track exposed compared to the one on the inner side. And this is important to point out because if you're trying to install the tracks and if they're reversed, it's not going to fit on right, and you basically have to repeat the entire install process until you finally find that magic sweet spot and the things line up accordingly. Like I stated before, this is true for the King Tiger as well as the Tiger 1 as well, so bear that in mind. So to pin the track together, I'm going to use one of the unpainted pins over here to guide the two links together and hold them in place, which will then allow me to install the appropriate pin and secure the track on permanently. So to do this, I need to first eat up the distance here of the links. Sometimes I could just use my vice grip hands for this. Other times I could use a zip tie to use as like a ratchet, but as you can see, my vice grip hands were more than suffice for pinning them in this manner. So at this point, you can see that I have the pin in place. The track is at its correct tension, but this is going to be the temporary pin. The actual pin itself I have right over here, still in its protective tape. I'm going to go ahead, peel this stuff off, and then I'll be able to install the final pin where it needs to go. And you'll see why I went ahead and pinned it together first with the unpainted one. Okay, so with the tape removed, you can see the pin now with only the few sections painted. And now, you could go ahead and install the pin from the opposite side. Keep in mind, this is actually the wrong way that the pin is installed. The way this tank is designed, the flat head of the pin is on the opposite side, and this is where the cotter pin goes, as you can see from the other examples. However, the reason why I installed this pin at this point here is because it's really convenient in installing it from the outside, and then once it's pinned in place, I can simply just drive the correct pin in, which will push this one out, and then the track will never lose its tension, and I'll never have to try to pin the two pieces together again with my hands. As you can see, it just dropped right out. Now I'm going to fully seat the new pin in further. Like so. And then from here, I'm going to go ahead and put on the retention washer and also the lock pin. This part's always a little tricky. Kind of feel like Wile E. Coyote trying to put that grenade pin back into the grenade and it always blows up in his face. But there we go. Once it finds that magic sweet spot, it just goes in place. You just bend the cotter pin, leads accordingly, and you're done. The track, on this side specifically, has now been fully mounted in place. Obviously, with the tracks installed, the model is really fleshing out very, very nicely, and it's another step closer to final completion. Also, I might as well take advantage of the nice sunlight that we have right now to get the model outdoors so you get to see and appreciate the paintwork and the weathering work now in better focus. At this point, I just want to mention that one thing that's cool about the King Tiger is that it's one of those few vehicles that just looks really great in both configurations, with the skirts or without the skirts. Or you could even do the other thing where you have partial skirts. Fortunately, with the way the Armortek kit is designed, this is something that can be done with minimal effort. Just basically undo some bolts and you can have the model displayed in either of those three configurations. But again, this has always been a crutch for any armor modeler who's working on the King Tiger. The King Tiger just looks awesome in either way, and generally if you're working on one in smaller scale and you run into this conundrum, the best course of solution is to really build an example of each. One with, one without, painted the same way. It's basically having your cake and eating it too. Hopping back to the tin work, here you can see what they look like, fully completed with the weathering applied. They have the exact same weathering effects as the remainder of the vehicle on both the inner panels as well as the outer sections, just to keep with continuity. Obviously, as the model is driven, the inner portions are going to get scratched up and nicked up just from the nature of foreign particulate getting kicked up by the tracks. And that's just par for the course on basically any type of tank model that is functional, that is. Although the majority of the weathering is out of the way, the one thing that I have not yet weathered at this point are the exhaust manifolds. These need to have a rusting agent applied to them first in order to get that nice charred rusty look that you see on many of my models. And then once the rust agent is complete, then I go ahead, circle back with some airbrushing in order to add the powder, or the carbon fouling. On that note, the powder fouling is also going to be applied to the muzzle as well as to the coax MG, but this is something that's going to be done in one swoop because it's the same paint that's used for both effects. So when I take care of one, I circle back and take care of the other as well. Obviously from here, the next thing to add to the model are what's referred to as the cake dressing, where it's just all the final implements, things like the tools, the tow cables, the antennas, all of that good stuff. That is at the point where we're at now, and this is also a really, really refreshing feeling to finally get to that point on this build. And honestly, I think it was totally worth it. I am just really digging the model's paint job, specifically now that it has been fully weathered. It really changed the color quite a bit compared to the way it looked like in the previous video. This here is usually the part of the build that I absolutely love the most. Seeing the model now coming to life compared to staring at it for months, in this case years on end, in its unassembled and partially assembled format. From this point, all that's left is just to basically cross the T's and dot the I's, make sure that everything is where it needs to be, everything is properly mounted, and everything is properly fleshed out. All of this may sound a bit tedious, but it should go by very, very quickly. So much so that I think I should have another video update within a week. So in about 5 to 7 days, expect to see another update of this model. At that point, I think it's going to be pretty much finished, honestly. So as I keep saying in these videos, this project is basically at the finish line, and it's just a matter of just a couple extra details here or there before this one can finally get the done stamp. And I think it's definitely going to be well worth it in the end. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek German King Tiger heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.